All right, so we're doing the share for the refuah of La Masha Basara, because Rebbetzin Leanne Cohen is going in for an operation, so for her treatment, and we wish her a speedy recovery. And it's our 600th share on Bava Kamma. We've done more, but that's been recorded.
I'll mind you both to the 600 and also to the refuah shlema of Rabbi Aaron Cohen's what's his wife.
Yeah.
Amen.
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 Amen. So well done, guys. Thank you for putting up with me. All right, so let's dive right in it. Now, I'll tell you where we ended off. There were different propositions of how Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva hold in terms of our Mishnah, and they did compare it to obviously other Mishnah just to get a little bit of consensus. So the last point we were at was proposing another interpretation, and it said, look, the Mishnah is actually dealing with a case where our Mishnah mimics Rabbi Tarfon. Why? Because the dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva pertains specifically to a case in which the robber did not swear falsely. In other words, it was taking the other Mishnah that resembled ours, and it said in that case, the robber did not make a false oath. In our Mishnah, the robber did make a false oath. So we want to see which one of the opinions in the previous Mishnah would mimic ours and who would be the author of it. So it's only in this case that Rabbi Tarfon would leniently allow him, the robber, to place the money before the various claimants and withdraw. So in other words, he gives it to the court-appointed judge. But Rabbi Tarfon concedes that basically in the case where the robber made a false oath, he must pay the value of theft to each and every one of the claimants if he wants a full teshuvah, because the minute he swore falsely, he's under a higher level of stringency, there's no question. So in other words, the Gemara reverses its understanding of the dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. It's now stating that they disagree only regarding a case where the robber did not swear. But all opinions, even Rabbi Tarfon, would agree that if he swore falsely, he must incur any expense in order to deliver payment to the hands of the victim, because it triggers the pasuk. So according to our Mishnah, which obligates a robber who swore falsely, but not an ordinary robber, to pursue the victim to Media in order to make amends, or any faraway land, that follows the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. This is what the proposition is. And Rabbi Akiva is more stringent, because he would require the thief to follow the victim anywhere to repay him, whether he made a false oath or not. That was actually the proposition. So we want to say, okay, so what's the reason for Rabbi Tarfon's opinion? Because just like Rabbi Akiva, he relies on the scriptural passage that states one who stole, basically the one, it says the one who stole and swore falsely, etc. To the one to whom it belongs shall he give on the day he admits his guilt. So when the thief admits that he did wrong, he has to give it into the hands of the victim. Obviously bring the principal amount, the one for surcharge to the victim, but the Hashem offering is for Hashem. So the edict that he gives it to the one to whom it belongs obviously obligates him specifically to deliver it by hand and not allow the victim to come get it when he's back in town. And that'll remedy the sin if he's looking for a kapara. Now the Gemara says, well, okay, so that's Rabbi Tarfon's opinion. They seem to agree. But how come Rabbi Akiva is more stringent? Or what does that stringency mean? So as far as Rabbi Akiva is concerned, he concedes that the biblical law does require the robber to incur the added expense only when he swore falsely. But he was saying that's a given. But even in the case where the robber didn't swear falsely, Rabbi Akiva penalizes him by a rabbinic edict and requires him to pay each and every one of the claimants. So it's not saying that he has to follow him to Media if he didn't swear falsely, but he would have to pay each and every one of the claimants. So in our Mishnah's case too, Rabbi Akiva would penalize the robber, and if he did know who the robber is, it's proposing that he'd even make the robber follow the victim to Media or any faraway land if he'd not sworn falsely. So just in summary as follows, right, is that whether the robber was honest or not. So you say, how can a robber be honest? There's a person that admits to their guilt and somebody that doesn't. Either way, he would have to pay each and every one of his claimants and also follow him to Media. Now, obviously, that's what the Gemara proposes. But I can tell you guys that if you know who the victim is, even Rabbi Akiva would state that if somebody claims another theft and he's not the victim and you know who the victim is, there's nothing to talk about. This payment of each and every one of the claimants is only in a case. It's implicit when you don't know who the victim is. If you know who it is, you don't have to do that. So in this case, it's mixing up two components, false oath and who you didn't know who the victim was. And the victim is at a faraway land. But the minute you add all those points, how could 5 victims be in a faraway land? So I just want to clarify. Take the non-knowing the victim out of it. And Rabbi Akiva says, guy was honest, guy was dishonest. You have to follow him to Media. That's what the latest proposition is. And in a case where you don't know who the victim is, Rabbi Tarfon, according to the one opinion, would concede with Rabbi Akiva and say, listen, if you really want a spiritual exoneration, you would have to pay each and every one of the victims. And if you don't, it suffices that you give it to the court, and the court would have a process where each one of the claimants would have to prove their validity, and it's pretty likely that the right person with the right evidence would be paid, and it would work out okay if it was unknown. But the problem is, Rabbi Tarfon is even saying, is that you don't really know, because it could be a case where a person lacks evidence, and then you haven't paid them, so you're not clean in Shemaim. That actually is the essence of it. Rabbi Akiva even goes one step further, and he says, listen, it doesn't matter if it's a robber or a purchaser that's failed to pay 5 storekeepers, not all 5, but he failed to pay one of the storekeepers. He comes out of the shuk and says, guys, I don't know which one of you I haven't paid. So Rabbi Akiva would then say, you pay each and every one of them to get restitution. And in that case, for sure, Rabbi Tarfon would say, listen, it's not like a robber. You let them sort it out amongst the court appointed agent. Okay. So far, you can see that Rabbi Akiva is far more stringent. Now, the Gemara is now questioning this latest interpretation of the Mishnah, and it says, look, regarding the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, which you say is stated in our Mishnah. In other words, you want to say that our Mishnah is like Rabbi Tarfon? Let's analyze it. Even in a case where the robber swore falsely, it's insufficient for him to be subject to the obligation stated in the Mishnah unless he confesses his sin and seeks atonement. So all it says is, if you remember in the Torah, in Numbers chapter 5, verse 7, it requires somebody that swore falsely to pay 1/5 more than the principal and Asham offering to Hashem. But that's only if he confesses his sin. Because at the end of the day, if witnesses come against him and he's adamant, not looking for kapara, so you don't make him pay the 1/5 surcharge, and you don't make him pay an Asham offering. Because at the end of the day, guys, it's actually for his benefit. Okay? So if this is the case, our particular Mishnah has to be dealing with a case in which the robber confesses and is in a search of atonement. Clearly, otherwise there's nothing to talk about. Okay? So accordingly, we want to know, why does it state specifically that the law applies to one who stole and swore falsely? Even without the false oath, it's necessary for him to deliver the stolen article to the hands of the victim if he truly seeks atonement. Because it was taught in a brisa, Rabbi Tarfon concedes with respect to one who voluntarily says to 2 people, look, I robbed a man from one of you, but I don't know which one of you it is. It's a hobby of mine. So I'm wanting to turn over a new leaf. So what do I do? So he has to give this one a manna and that one a manna. So Rabbi Tarfon is talking about two different principles here. That if he confesses on his own and he makes an effort to rectify sin and attain atonement, and atonement, technically, guys, is only guaranteed if he pays each and every one of the claimants, then Rabbi Tarfon would be like Rabbi Akiva, because he requires a penitent robber. And if he's penitent and he actually does want to do the right thing, and he does want to seek atonement, he has to incur the added expense, even if he did not make a false oath. So the Mishnah wants to say, well, how can you say that the Mishnah, which imposes this requirement on a penitent robber, only when he swore falsely, follows Rabbi Tarfon? Because it's saying, look, it can't just be Rabbi Tarfon or Rabbi Akiva. They're in very, very similar boats in terms of how to really achieve atonement. So the Gemara now refuted both the original explanation and the explanation I just explained to you, that the Mishnah follows either Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Tarfon. Because both the explanations I've given over the last couple of days were based on the assumption that the dispute between these Tanaim extends to our Mishnah's case. But the Gemara is forced to retract it, okay? Because we assumed that the case was one in which the victim traveled to media is similar to one in which is not positively identified. Because either way, the robber must incur a great expense in order to deliver payment properly, whether you pay each and every one of your victims or whether you follow the victim to a faraway land. So we now postulating that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon would each maintain a similar opinion, as he does in the other case, and it's not really going to change. Okay, so now we want a little bit of clarity from this point. So Rava said, if you're looking at our Mishnah, it's slightly different than the one disputed by Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because in the Mishnah's case, the robber knew who he robbed. Okay, he knew who he robbed. And as we proved, he also confessed to him, and he's prepared to return the robbed money in order to gain atonement. So we have to say that since it's possible for him to return the money to its owner without any complication when the victim calls for it, and the difficulty is simply that he has to travel to a faraway land like Media, it's actually considered as though the victim has told the robber who's confessed, let the money remain for me in your hand until I return to me. In other words, the victim is okay with it. This person didn't have to, he wasn't, forced to come out with the truth by witnesses. He wants it to teshuva. And therefore, although he's dishonest that he stole originally, he's the one that came clean. There was no way that the victim had any evidence. They said, listen, you've actually got the money at the end of the day. I'm across the world. When I come back, give it to me. Let the money remain for me in your hand until I return. Because the robber is looking for atonement for his false oath, because we're not talking about a person that never lied at all. This is the key. We're talking about a case where he did lie. It was a case afterwards where he came clean and said, listen, I lied. I want to pay the fifth. I want to pay the asham, and I want to pay the principal. In that case, that's when the stringency kicks in, because there are two sins. There's the sin of the robbery, and there's the sin of the false oath. So because he's made atonement on the false oath, he can only gain atonement by actually repaying the victim. There's no point in him bringing the asham offering if he hasn't paid it back. It's absolutely a waste of time. So the money that the robber is prepared to pay regarding having been deposited with him for safekeeping by the victim, so to speak, until he returns from his travels, that's the way Rashi explains it, is different, because a robber has no obligation beyond notifying the victim of his willingness to pay and holding the money for him until he returns. So because he already confessed to the victim and notified him, he can wait for the victim to come and collect his payment. Now, in order to suffice with the Torah obligation, I would suggest that you give it to the court-appointed judge. Not sorry, guys. I suggest that you give it to the court-appointed agent. Why? Because if it's in your hands, you're responsible. The minute you hand it over to your local town's court-appointed agent, you haven't traveled far, and it's out of your responsibility realm. Gavin, what we are saying is now that there are two distinctions here. There's a robber that wants proper teshuvah because he has confessed without witnesses pressing him, and there is one that never swore falsely at all. Now, the one that swore falsely, it's not sufficient for him just to keep the money with himself, because he has also established a certain amount of distrust by having sworn falsely, even though he now wants an atonement and confession. The guy's a bit unpredictable. So the issue is that it invokes and it triggers the obligation to return it to his victim, because we don't trust this guy's mental stability. Do you get what I'm saying? If a robber never lied at all, at that case, we trust the money to go with him. Now, there was a rabbinical edict which suggested that you leave it with a court-appointed agent for the victim to return, because if the expenses of the trip supersede the principal, nobody's going to want to make it to teshuvah. Do you get what I'm saying? So we're discerning between a robber that confesses and wants atonement versus a robber that never swore falsely at all. A robber that never swore falsely at all can technically keep the money for himself until the victim comes back, as long as he informs the victim. Although without calling a victim, I don't know how he would communicate that. Okay, but perhaps there was somebody that he trusted to deliver the message, but not somebody he trusted enough with money that was going to media, whatever the case may be. So if there was no false testimony, he could hold the money until the victim returned. If he did swear falsely, he'd have to go to media or any faraway land and spend the money to give it to his victim's hands as the pasuk required. Now, the rabbinic enactment came afterwards to make sure you can put it with the court-appointed agent, because nobody's going to schlep when the expenses of the logistics of accommodation and flights, etc., supersede the principal. Okay, that's what we're dealing with here at the moment. Why? Because you say, since the robber requires atonement for his false oath, and the Torah states that he can gain atonement only by actually repaying the victim in person, it's insufficient unless the payment reaches the victim's hands, and if necessary, the robber must pursue him to media for this purpose. But if the robber did not swear falsely, it suffices that the money remain with him with the robber as a deposit until the victim comes and takes it. Therefore, the Mishnah states that the robber must pursue the victim to media only if he swore falsely. Both Rabbi Talmud and Rabbi Akiva agree that this is the law in a case where the victim's identity is known. They disagree only regarding a case where the victim has not been identified, so that if the robber retains possession of the money, he will actually never be able to pay the true victim. In that case, the money cannot be considered as having been deposited with him by the victim. So Rabbi Talmud rules that it's nevertheless sufficient for the robber to place the money before the claimants and withdraw, and Rabbi Akiva requires him to pay each and every one of the claimants. This applies whether the robber swore falsely about the theft or not. Okay. So Rabbi Akiva maintains that every robber is legally required to either pay the victim personally or hold the money on deposit for him in anticipation of his return. That's every robber. If he doesn't know which of the 5 people is his victim, so that he's unable guys to do the latter, then he has no means of discharging his obligation other than pay each and every one of them, and the court forces him to do so even if he did not swear falsely. That's according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Talmud, on the other hand, maintains that it always suffices for a robber to declare his willingness to pay in the presence of the claimants, and then to keep the money safe until one of them is able to verify his claim with evidence. And this is the letter of the law, even in a case where the robber swore falsely. But Rabbi Talmud concedes, however, that if the robber seeks atonement before the heavenly court, he should pay each and every one of the claimants, whether he swore falsely or not, when the identity is unknown, because there's no other way that you can discharge your obligations before Shemaim and make a full atonement. So let me just tell you what we're dealing with in summary. Okay, when the robber knows who his victim is, as in our Mishnah's case, all of them are in agreement as to the law. What is the law? If he swore falsely and seeks atonement, he must pursue the victim to Media or any faraway land, or make any unusual effort to pay him. That's stated in the Mishnah. The second point is the proceeding applies only if one is in search of atonement for heaven, because the court can't force you to travel to Media for payment, even if you swore falsely. Okay? It does say that you've discharged your legal obligation if you give it to the court-appointed agent, because now you've given it to somebody trustworthy. If the robber didn't swear, he satisfies even the requirement of the heavenly court by holding the money on deposit for the victim. In other words, he doesn't trigger that other pasuk. So he gives it to the court-appointed agent when the victim returns. It's only when he swore falsely now it has to go schlepping, and I think then there was that rabbinical edict to allow him to give it to the court-appointed agent, and I think even by heaven that would be okay, but that's only if you know the identity of the victim. But the problem is when the robber doesn't know the identity of his victim, as the other Mishnah's case, not ours, because ours clearly you know who the victim is, because otherwise how would you know who to give the principal, the 1/5 on top of the principal for the penalty for the false oath, nor the asham, which goes to Hashem. I mean, you can't give the asham until you made restitution. So when you don't know who the victim is, according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, that's the issue where they're in dispute. Rabbi Akiva maintains that the law requires him to pay each and every one of the claimants, even when there was no false oath, whether there was a false oath or not. Because if you don't know who the victim is, it's meaningless. You haven't made restitution. Rabbi Akiva says, look, the law allows him to hold the money and deposit, even if he did swear falsely. But Rabbi Tarfon concedes that, look, you should give it to the court-appointed agent because you can't have five guys fighting it out physically. The strongest one will win. And the people have to bring evidence to the court, and that would suffice from a legal standpoint. But even Rabbi Tarfon agrees with Rabbi Akiva that if you seek atonement before heaven, you want to make a full restitution, and you're penitent about your sin, you want to make a full teshuvah and be redeemed, you have no choice but to pay each and every claimant, whether you had a false oath or not. Why? Because you need to make sure the person's paid back, otherwise heaven will hold you responsible. Okay? So, that is it in a nutshell. What do you think, guys?
Yeah, good. I want to say something. There is that one example where, which you gave us, I think, where if a guy walks into 5 different shops and he can't remember which one he didn't pay from, then those 5 people can't bring proof, obviously. So in that particular case, you'd have to pay all of them regardless. So I'm just saying that was a good example.
Yeah, according to Rabbi Akiva, there's nothing to discuss. Is that, you see, this is where Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva disagree slightly, because Rabbi Akiva says if a person, whether he robbed on purpose and he committed a crime or didn't, the fact of it is should have been more diligent with paying people, and therefore his responsibility is to make sure each and every person is paid, whether he's a purchaser or whether he's a robber. Rabbi Tarfon says it's not an illegal act, and therefore it suffices to put the money before the court-appointed agent and let the shopkeepers bring evidence as to who is outstanding with payment. Now, that is the legal standpoint. They might totally agree with you, Gavin, that from a heavenly standpoint, each and every one of the claimant would have to be paid, even in a less stringent case of a purchaser.
Yeah, and what I'm saying really is that the shopkeepers won't be able to bring proof in all probability. They won't know, So so in that particular case, they won't be able to bring proof. So they'd have to pay from whether it's Rabbi Tarfon or the other one. They're going to have to pay.
Yeah, but legally, Rabbi
I mean,
Tarfon,
he's going to have to pay the purchaser because there's no proof that can come from anybody. It's purely his word against the shopkeepers. They can't fight over it, so he just has to pay all of them because he's voluntary saying that. Listen, I came into your shop. I didn't pay at one of your shops, at one of the shops, I'm not sure which one, and therefore I owe all of you. And no one could bring proof. It's unlikely. So I'm just saying that particular example. Yeah, there's nothing discussed in that example that you just have to pay.
yeah, but there's a difference between the legal requirement and the heavenly obligation. They're two different. Rabbi Tarfon would not say legally that in a case where it wasn't a official crime, nor in a case where you'd have to pay 5 times the amount legally you'd have to do it. So if you're extra pious and you want heavenly cleansing of a possible theft, then that would be required, but certainly not legally. Rabbi Kiva says legally. That's the difference. They're both.
Okay. So legally, Rabbi Akiva says you have to, and Rabbi Tarfon says not. And then as far as the heaven goes, they obviously both say that you have to pay. Obviously,
Yeah,
so
correct. Now,
okay.
you see, this is where the sophistication, Kevin, came in terms of shops, Arth, is because, like, let's not take the 21st century where you've got cameras and webcams and but the thing of it is that if you've got good stock controls and people watching from a security point of view, we're talking pre-technology, okay? And you cannot take an item out of a shop until they check the Kabbalah, they check the receipt, and they check the item, and you've got proper security measures. You are actually doing a service to both yourself, getting paid, as well as you stopping somebody else from sinning. You've got these obligations as a shopkeeper for yourself and the other person, because you allowing the other person to sin to a certain extent if you don't have the correct mechanisms to come into place, and you allowing yourself to be robbed. You have these obligations to have proper due diligence processes to make sure that there's no pilfering, thievery, shoplifting, etc. You have to. Yeah. Kev, you look tired.
Yeah.
Okay?
I'm very tired. Yeah. But Damon, what do you mean? The shopkeeper said that he what did it to
I'm saying
prevent
this
prevent
incident
theft,
could.
to prevent people stealing from his
I'm saying this
store?
incident could only have taken place if one of the shopkeepers was moggy, as well as the victim. Let's just say the victim didn't do it on purpose. It can only occur when two parties were moggy. If either of them were on the board, this wouldn't have happened. And therefore, the default position, especially in South Africa, is that people are going to rob you if you give them the opportunity.
Yeah.
And therefore, what happens is, in a conscientious country, I saw in Israel, which was interesting, is that 1 out of 10 times they'll check if you've paid your bus pass. They'll come around, and usually in a period where you really don't feel like people, they'll come around at that time. But generally, they don't come around, and they trust you that if you're going to do the right thing. In South Africa, it would never happen. Do you get what I'm saying? There's no trance. They've taken the place apart brick by brick, bolt by bolt. So what I'm saying is, in a place where you know that there's pilfering or shoplifting, what you have to have is a system where there's good stock controls, cameras today, but even when there was no cameras, each stock item is measured. You have one exit point, one person checking bills. You get what I'm saying? You have proper processes in case somebody's trying to steal for your spiritual benefit, and theirs. You have to. And there's a different case because most stock theft is actually internal by staff members. That is an absolute fact. It's not by having good client control. It's always the pilfering. They use the term pilfering as opposed to shoplifting, Arthur, because pilfering means the staff are stealing. Do you get what I'm saying? And that's where your most common theft is. A common case is a car wash, Kevin, where you're going for a car wash and they'll wash your car and you pay cash and they keep the money. I know my dad had a car wash at one stage in Waverley. And these are, people look at plots and schemes and everything else as far as that's concerned. By the way, I was sneezing yesterday in shul, and Barry Milner says to me, he said, what are you taking? He says, you've got allergies. What are you taking for them? He said, I said, I'm not taking anything. He said, what are you allergic to? You can see I'm not a morning person. I came there for shachrit. I said, people. And I walked out. I'm not a morning person, guys.
Well, there's nothing you can take for that anyway, you know. So it's one of those things.
You can, Gavin. You can take a holiday.
Yes, you can. Absolutely, yeah. Or you. That's right. You can change your location. That's all.
Yeah, guys. Mazel tov on the 600th. You are all superstars. Seriously, mate.
No. Well done to you. I took a bit of time to get into it. Sorry, I was completely like dopey, but I woke up and got into it.
Listen, and we're explaining things easier now. We're taking very complicated concepts and making it simple step by step. And we're doing Makot, and Makot is a short book. So I think to have Kevin much shorter achievement goals is going to be a nice break for you. Once we
We'll
talk
finish
How many
stuff
ducks is
quicker as
Makot?
well. That's for all of us.
I think it's like 20. I think it's 20 something daf. Maybe 24, 25. I don't know.
That's quite short compared to what we've been doing. Wow. Okay, that will be a nice one. It's also good to get it under our belt, you know.
I think so. I think maybe there are quite a few small books like that, perhaps.
That we can get under our belt just to get improve our.
Well, it's only got 3 chapters and it ends on 24b, which means we can have things like that under our belt.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I thought it would be a nice
idea.
change. Okay, we're going to go through something light like lashes. That's what my good is.
Yeah, which I'm trying to encourage Damon to issue lashes to these people when he wakes up in the morning, as opposed to destroying them. Listen, okay, that's a separate issue. It's a private matter. Yeah, staff, well done. I'm actually looking forward to my quote, because I think it's a precursor to what we've been doing, and we probably should have done that first, in essence, because I think it's the basics. Isn't it?
No. So the thing of it is, Makot is part of Nezikin. Rav Schottenstein did teach it. Rav Aran Cohen did teach it. I have done some of it, not all of it, but it does deal with some of the precursors of false witnesses and other things in the city of Red.
I think it would help us, because I remember you had kind of done Makot, and the guys that had done Makot found Sanhedrin much easier, and I presume you'd find Bava Kamma a little bit easier as well, because you'll have a little bit more background. So I think it's good that we're doing it. I'm actually looking forward to it as well.
Kev, what were you going to say?
You live in Tel Aviv. The game of beach pat is called matkot, because they punish the ball. They lash the ball to each other.
Really? Oh, that's interesting.
They give lashes to the ball, Gavin, with the beach bat.
So you go there and you just hit the ball 39 times, and then you cover. It's your 39 lashes.
The person who hit the
first one teach us quickly. Teach us. We've got a minute left.
Okay, so just one thing we can always. Okay, so I wondered yesterday. I asked my friend's son, who's in yeshiva high school, what is the purpose of the maftir? Before you say the last part of the seventh aliyah, maftir is included. Then you repeat it, but the purpose of the maftir is special reading the Torah done on Shabbos and certain holidays only. It means concluding in Hebrew, and refers to the reading that comes after the regular Torah portion. But it's quite weird why it's included in the seventh perek, but it's actually a separate. It's considered as like a separate mini parsha on its own. And I've got some notes here. It serves. It's in ancient times, the Jewish people faced persecution and restrictions on their religious practices. Maftir allowed them to publicly demonstrate their commitment to studying and observing the Torah, even when they were not able to read the entire portion. Okay, I don't know if we're not going to have enough time. Okay, I've got something else for tomorrow, because you just read things every week, or you notice things. or you go through things in the siddur and you don't really know. Sometimes the commentary doesn't tell you what's the purpose of it is and why you do